In the early 1940s, the Pacific became one of the most violent theaters of the Second World War. The conflict between the Empire of Japan and the United States was not merely a clash of armies, it was a collision of world views. It was industrial power against imperial ambition, democracy against militarist nationalism, and perhaps most powerfully, two societies conditioned to see each other not as human beings, but as existential threats. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the war escalated rapidly. Island after island became battlegrounds: Saipan, Okinawa, Iwo Jima. These names would come to symbolize ferocious combat, staggering casualties, and a level of brutality that shocked even seasoned observers of global war. But to understand what Japanese women believed would happen if captured by American forces, we must first understand the psychological environment that shaped their expectations. From early childhood, many citizens of wartime Japan were immersed in state-directed ideology. Loyalty to the emperor was not simply political, it was spiritual. The emperor was portrayed as divine, the embodiment of national unity and destiny. To serve him was sacred, to die for him was honorable, to surrender was unthinkable. Central to this mindset was Bushido, the so-called way of the warrior. While historically complex and evolving, wartime authorities simplified and amplified it into a rigid moral code. Honor was absolute, shame was permanent. Death before surrender was not only praised, it was institutionalized as virtue. Military training reinforced this doctrine relentlessly. Soldiers were told that capture was worse than death. Civilians absorbed similar messaging. Schools, newspapers, radio broadcasts all repeated a singular theme: the enemy was merciless. Americans, in particular, were depicted as barbaric, cruel, and morally corrupt. Propaganda posters showed exaggerated, monstrous images of foreign soldiers. Radio programs warned of atrocities. Newspapers described alleged crimes committed against civilians in occupied territories. Whether exaggerated or fabricated, these stories served a purpose: to eliminate hesitation, to prevent surrender, and to harden resolve. Fear was not incidental, it was strategic. For women living in territories that would soon become battlefields, this propaganda had specific and terrifying implications. They were told that American soldiers would torture prisoners, that women would be assaulted, that families would be humiliated, that capture meant dishonor not only for oneself, but for one's ancestors and descendants. By 1944 and 1945, as American forces advanced across the Pacific, panic spread through Japanese-held islands. Civilians were often trapped between retreating Japanese forces and advancing American troops. Supplies dwindled, communication collapsed, rumors flourished. On islands such as Saipan, entire communities hid in caves, terrified of what would come next. Some civilians were instructed by Japanese soldiers that surrender was forbidden. In extreme cases, families were encouraged to take their own lives rather than be captured. The fear of imagined brutality became more powerful than the instinct to survive. For women, nurses, volunteers, mothers, and daughters, the situation was especially acute. Many served in auxiliary roles, tending to wounded soldiers, delivering supplies, supporting logistical operations. Others were simply civilians caught in war zones, yet all were exposed to the same ideological conditioning. They were told that American troops would not distinguish between combatants and civilians, that mercy was weakness, that foreign soldiers lacked moral restraint. These warnings were repeated so frequently that they became psychological certainty. Consider the emotional architecture of that fear. It was not vague anxiety, it was detailed, visual, graphic. Women imagined specific horrors because those horrors had been described to them repeatedly. The human mind, when fed a steady stream of terrifying images, begins to accept them as inevitable reality. At the same time, another cultural force intensified the dread, the stigma of surrender. In wartime Japan, surrender was equated with betrayal. A captured person did not simply lose freedom, they lost honor. Returning home after imprisonment could mean social exclusion. Families might face disgrace. Silence often followed. Thus, the prospect of capture carried two layers of terror. First, the physical fear of violence at enemy hands. Second, the social and spiritual fear of permanent shame. The Battle of Okinawa in 1945 exemplified this psychological crisis. As American forces landed in overwhelming numbers, civilians were caught in relentless bombardment. Leaflets were dropped urging surrender, promising humane treatment. Yet many civilians distrusted these messages. Why would the enemy show compassion? Propaganda had already answered that question. They would not. The gap between expectation and reality had not yet been revealed. In caves and makeshift shelters, women clutched children and waited. Some rehearsed what they might say if confronted. Others resolved never to be taken alive. Stories circulated rapidly, some true, many distorted. Fear magnified every rumor. Meanwhile, American military doctrine regarding prisoners of war was shaped by international conventions and strategic considerations. The United States had ratified agreements concerning the treatment of POWs. Official policy mandated humane treatment, medical care, and protection from violence. Discipline violations were punishable offenses. But Japanese civilians did not know this, or if they heard such claims, they dismissed them as deception. This disconnect between policy and perception created one of the most dramatic psychological confrontations of the Pacific War. Women who expected immediate brutality would soon encounter something entirely different. Yet in this first chapter of their story, they did not know that. All they knew was the narrative they had been given since childhood. The enemy was monstrous, capture was doom, death was preferable. And so, as American forces advanced closer, fear reached its peak, not because violence had already occurred, but because it was anticipated with absolute certainty. This is the power of propaganda. It does not merely inform, it constructs reality inside the mind. It defines what outcomes are imaginable and which are impossible. For many Japanese women in the final months of the war, mercy was impossible. Humanity from the enemy was unimaginable. They stood at the edge of capture, convinced they understood what awaited them. They were wrong. And that realization, sudden, disorienting, and profound, would become the turning point of their experience. But before that moment arrived, there was only war, only indoctrination, only fear. The stage was set not just for military defeat, but for psychological shock.
By mid-1944, the Pacific War had entered its decisive phase. American forces were advancing steadily across island chains once considered impenetrable defensive barriers of the Empire of Japan. Naval blockades tightened, air superiority was overwhelming, supply lines collapsed, entire garrisons were isolated. For civilians, especially women, the war was no longer distant thunder. It was immediate, audible, visible, inescapable. When American troops landed on Saipan in June 1944, the fighting was catastrophic. Japanese military command had prepared for a final defensive stand. Civilians were instructed to assist when possible and to avoid capture at all costs. Rumors spread that Americans would torture prisoners, desecrate bodies, violate women, and kill children. As artillery shells fell and machine gun fire echoed through the hills, thousands of civilians fled into caves. Among them were nurses, teenage volunteers, elderly women, and mothers carrying infants. They carried almost nothing, sometimes a few rice balls, sometimes a family photograph. What they carried most was fear. Inside those caves, time distorted. Days blended into nights. Food dwindled. Water became scarce. Outside, the sounds of battle intensified. Japanese soldiers moved in and out, often wounded, sometimes fatalistic. Some repeated the same message: do not surrender. In certain tragic cases, mass suicides occurred near cliffs later known as Suicide Cliff and Banzai Cliff. Civilians, convinced that capture meant unspeakable suffering, jumped into the sea. The psychological grip of propaganda had reached its most devastating consequence. Yet, not all followed that path. Some women waited. The first encounters with American soldiers were often chaotic and confused. Language barriers compounded fear. A shouted command in English could sound like aggression. A raised rifle, even if held cautiously, triggered panic. Women expected immediate violence. Some trembled uncontrollably. Others shielded children with their bodies. A few attempted to bow in surrender, unsure whether the gesture would be understood. What happened next contradicted everything they had been told. American soldiers, trained to secure prisoners, approached carefully. Hands were signaled upward. Weapons were lowered once compliance was clear. Medics were sometimes summoned immediately if injuries were visible. Water was offered. In some cases, chocolate or canned rations were handed to children. The reaction was not relief, it was disbelief. Many women assumed this was temporary, a calculated deception before brutality began. They flinched at sudden movements. They avoided eye contact. Some refused food, suspecting poison. Others were too shocked to speak. The surrender process itself was disorienting. Women were searched for weapons. Personal belongings were inspected. They were gathered into controlled groups and escorted away from combat zones. The structured, procedural nature of the process clashed with expectations of chaos and cruelty. On Okinawa in 1945, similar scenes unfolded on a larger scale. The battle was one of the bloodiest in the Pacific. Civilians were trapped between entrenched Japanese forces and advancing American divisions. Propaganda leaflets promising humane treatment were dropped from aircraft, but trust was minimal. Yet as civilians emerged from hiding, often waving white cloth, many encountered restraint rather than savagery. American troops were under orders to separate civilians from combatants, to process prisoners systematically, and to prevent harm where possible. This did not mean the battlefield was gentle. Combat remained brutal. Civilians were sometimes accidentally caught in crossfire. Fear was still pervasive. But the specific horror that women had anticipated, immediate assault upon capture, did not materialize as expected. The psychological rupture began at that precise moment. Imagine standing before a soldier you were told was less than human. You have prepared yourself for pain, humiliation, perhaps death. Instead, you are handed water. The mind struggles to reconcile contradiction. Is this mercy genuine? Is it strategic? Is it temporary? For many women, the first night in custody was sleepless. They waited for something terrible to happen. Every footstep outside a tent triggered anxiety. Every unfamiliar sound reinforced tension. Nothing happened. Food distribution followed military ration protocols. Medical stations treated dehydration, malnutrition, and shrapnel wounds. Children were prioritized. Elderly civilians received attention. Translators, sometimes Japanese Americans serving in U.S. intelligence units, attempted communication. The presence of Japanese-speaking personnel was particularly shocking.
It challenged the idea of a monolithic, dehumanized enemy. Some women were startled to discover that individuals in U.S. uniform understood their language and addressed them calmly. Still, suspicion lingered. Some women believed kindness was a psychological tactic designed to extract information. Others feared that abuse might occur later, away from witnesses. The indoctrination of years does not dissolve in a single afternoon. Yet over days, patterns emerged. Guards rotated predictably. Violence did not erupt. Rations were distributed consistently. Basic sanitation was organized. The anticipated collapse into chaos did not occur. For nurses who had served near front lines, surrender carried additional shame. They had internalized duty to the emperor and to wounded soldiers. Being alive in captivity felt like failure. Some avoided speaking altogether. Others wept quietly, not from mistreatment, but from the collapse of everything they had believed about honor. The moment of surrender, therefore, was not only a military event, it was an ideological fracture. American military doctrine required documentation of prisoners. Names were recorded, ages estimated, health conditions noted. This bureaucratic procedure, mundane yet orderly, further destabilized expectations. Brutal enemies do not fill out forms. They do not assign identification numbers and medical evaluations. And yet, here it was. Children adapted fastest. Hunger overrides ideology. When offered unfamiliar canned goods or sweets, many accepted eagerly. Mothers watched in confusion as their children interacted without fear. The next generation seemed less constrained by propaganda. The emotional turning point often came not in grand gestures, but in small moments. A soldier adjusting a blanket over a sleeping child. A medic cleaning a wound with careful precision. A guard stepping aside to allow privacy. Each small act accumulated. By the end of the first week in custody, a silent realization began forming among many women. The narrative had been incomplete, perhaps false, perhaps deliberately distorted. But acknowledging that possibility required confronting another painful truth, that their own government had cultivated fear as a weapon. This realization did not produce immediate reconciliation. It produced disorientation. Identity had been built around certainty. Now, certainty dissolved. The battlefield had delivered defeat. Capture delivered revelation. In the span of hours, the image of the enemy shifted from monstrous abstraction to human presence. Not universally kind, not flawless, but recognizably human. The shock was not that Americans refrained from violence. The shock was that they behaved predictably, procedurally, even professionally. And in that contrast between expectation and reality, the psychological transformation truly began. The women who had braced for annihilation now faced a different challenge: survival in a world where the enemy did not conform to the story they had always been told. The war was not over, but something fundamental had already changed.
Capture was the rupture. The camp was the test. Once removed from active combat zones, Japanese women, nurses, civilian volunteers, and non-combatants were transported to organized holding areas established by the United States military. These were not improvised prison pits or chaotic enclosures. They were structured, regulated environments governed by military procedure. For many women, the first sight of the camp perimeter triggered renewed anxiety. Barbed wire, guard towers, armed sentries. The architecture of confinement is universally intimidating. It signals loss of autonomy. It reinforces vulnerability. Yet daily life inside these camps unfolded in ways that directly contradicted years of indoctrinated fear. Upon arrival, prisoners underwent intake processing. Names were recorded when possible. Ages and places of origin were documented. Medical personnel conducted examinations, checking for dehydration, infection, malnutrition, and untreated wounds. Those in critical condition were transferred to field hospitals. This clinical efficiency felt surreal. The expectation had been cruelty. The reality was bureaucracy. Food distribution followed standardized ration schedules. Rice was not always available. Instead, prisoners received canned meat, bread, powdered milk, and sometimes unfamiliar items like corned beef or chocolate. At first, suspicion dominated. Some women refused to eat, convinced the food might be poisoned or contaminated. Hunger gradually overrode hesitation. Water access was structured. Latrine areas were designated to prevent disease. In tropical environments such as Okinawa and Saipan, sanitation was a critical logistical concern. American military engineers prioritized drainage and waste management to reduce outbreaks of dysentery and cholera. The predictability of routine began to alter psychological states. Wake-up calls, meal times, medical rounds, lights out. Order replaced chaos. For women who had spent weeks hiding in caves under bombardment, the absence of shell fire was disorienting. Silence at night felt unnatural. Some struggled to sleep, not from fear of assault, but from the sudden absence of imminent death. Medical care was particularly transformative. Nurses who had previously treated wounded Japanese soldiers observed American medics applying antiseptics, stitching wounds, administering quinine for malaria, and isolating contagious patients. Treatment was not contingent upon cooperation or political alignment. It was procedural. This created cognitive tension. If the enemy was barbaric, why prioritize the health of prisoners? Language barriers persisted. However, interpreters, often Nisei, Japanese Americans serving in intelligence and translation units, facilitated communication. Hearing fluent Japanese spoken by individuals in American uniform unsettled many detainees. It complicated the narrative of absolute cultural opposition. Children in the camps adapted fastest. They explored, cautiously at first, then more openly. Makeshift play areas emerged. Soldiers sometimes distributed candy or chewing gum, items unfamiliar yet fascinating. Mothers observed these interactions with a mixture of relief and apprehension. Trust develops incrementally. The guards themselves varied in temperament, but military discipline imposed boundaries. Mistreatment was subject to reprimand. The presence of commanding officers reinforced structure. This was not an environment of unchecked brutality. It was an institution operating under codified rules. It is critical, however, to avoid romanticization. Camps were still sites of confinement. Freedom was restricted. Privacy was minimal. Cultural misunderstandings occurred frequently. Food was basic. Climate conditions were harsh. Emotional strain was constant. Yet the anticipated horrors, systematic violence, deliberate humiliation, sexual assault as policy, did not materialize in the way propaganda had predicted. For women who had internalized the stigma of surrender, the greater struggle became internal rather than external. They grappled with shame. In Japanese wartime ideology, captivity implied moral failure. Even in humane conditions, they felt spiritually compromised. Some avoided forming connections with guards, fearing emotional betrayal of their homeland. Others remained distant, answering questions minimally. But over time, exposure to consistent behavior eroded rigid assumptions. Comparison also played a role, though often indirectly. Reports circulated among prisoners about the treatment of Allied POWs held by Japanese forces earlier in the war. While individual experiences varied, historical records indicate that Allied prisoners in some Japanese camps endured severe malnutrition, forced labor, and abuse. The contrast was not lost on those who became aware of it. Inside the American-administered camps, labor expectations for civilian women were limited. Some assisted with cooking or cleaning communal areas. Others helped organize childcare. Structured activity reduced idleness and anxiety. Psychologically, routine stabilizes perception. When days become predictable, threat assessment decreases. Hypervigilance subsides. Women who once flinched at every approaching footstep began to distinguish between routine patrols and genuine emergencies. Religious observance was not systematically suppressed. Small prayer gatherings occurred informally. Cultural practices continued in modest ways, sharing stories, maintaining forms of etiquette, preserving dignity through grooming and mutual support. One of the most profound shifts occurred in interpersonal perception. Guards who were initially seen as faceless embodiments of enemy propaganda gradually acquired individual traits. One might be stern but fair, another reserved but polite. Humanization, once resisted, became unavoidable. This did not erase loyalty to Japan, it complicated hatred. The emotional turning point for many women was not dramatic, it was cumulative. A medic who treated a child's fever with visible concern, a guard who intervened to prevent a misunderstanding from escalating, a translator who explained procedures patiently rather than shouting commands. Each interaction chipped away at the monolith of fear constructed over years. Weeks passed. Physical health improved for many detainees due to consistent nutrition and medical oversight. Psychological states shifted from acute terror to guarded adaptation. Yet uncertainty remained about the future. How long would confinement last? What would happen after the war? Would families accept their return? Would society view them as survivors or as symbols of disgrace? Inside the camp, survival became practical rather than existential. The anticipated nightmare had not unfolded. Instead, life assumed a constrained but stable rhythm. This stability produced a startling realization. The enemy was neither mythical nor uniformly monstrous. They were soldiers operating within a military framework that, at least in this context, imposed limits. For women raised to believe capture meant annihilation of body and honor, the camp experience forced reevaluation. Not immediate forgiveness, not ideological conversion, but reconsideration. The war outside continued with relentless intensity. Bombing campaigns escalated. Cities would soon burn. The geopolitical outcome was approaching its decisive conclusion. Inside the wire, however, a quieter transformation unfolded. The most powerful shock was no longer the absence of violence at capture. It was the sustained presence of order. And in that order, fear slowly lost its absolute authority.
If capture shattered expectation, captivity reshaped routine. But the deepest conflict did not occur at the moment of surrender, nor inside the camp perimeter. It unfolded internally. For Japanese women raised under the ideological framework of the Empire of Japan, identity was inseparable from duty. Duty to family, duty to emperor, duty to nation. These were not abstract loyalties, they were moral anchors reinforced through education, media, and community life. To be captured by the enemy was not merely a logistical circumstance, it was a moral fracture. Even in humane conditions under the custody of the United States military, many women felt an overwhelming sense of shame. They had survived, but survival itself felt like compromise. This internal struggle was intensified by the cultural residue of Bushido as interpreted in wartime propaganda. Though historically a complex and evolving ethical system, wartime authorities simplified it into a rigid expectation: endurance, loyalty, sacrifice. Surrender contradicted all three. Inside the camps on Okinawa and elsewhere, women often avoided discussing the moment of capture. Silence became a coping mechanism. Some replayed the event repeatedly in their minds, questioning whether they could have resisted longer. Others wondered whether death would have preserved honor more fully than survival. These were not theatrical reflections, they were quiet, persistent doubts.
At the same time, their lived experiences under American custody continued to contradict propaganda. No systematic brutality, no ritual humiliation, no state-sanctioned assault. Instead, procedural detention, medical treatment, regulated food distribution. This contradiction produced cognitive dissonance. If the enemy behaved humanely, what did that imply about the narrative they had been taught? And if that narrative was flawed, what else might be untrue? Such realizations destabilize identity. When foundational beliefs erode, individuals confront an unsettling vacuum. For many women, loyalty to Japan remained intact, but trust in wartime messaging weakened. The emotional landscape grew complex. Gratitude toward captors felt dangerous. Some women resisted any internal acknowledgement of fair treatment, fearing it signaled betrayal. Others quietly accepted the reality while compartmentalizing their national loyalty. Children adapted differently. Younger detainees, less deeply indoctrinated, often interacted with guards more openly. They learned fragments of English. They accepted unfamiliar food without ideological hesitation. Mothers observed this with ambivalence, relief at their children's safety, discomfort at their adaptability. Another dimension of struggle concerned anticipated reintegration. Rumors circulated within camps. How would post-war Japanese society treat former captives? Would families welcome them or regard them as dishonored? Historically, post-war Japan underwent profound transformation, especially after the surrender announced by Emperor Hirohito in August 1945. Yet during captivity, women could not foresee how sweeping those changes would be. They imagined returning home under a cloud of suspicion. The stigma of surrender was not theoretical. In some communities, former prisoners, male and female, were indeed treated with emotional distance. Silence often surrounded their experiences. Many chose not to speak publicly about captivity for decades. Psychologists studying wartime trauma note that identity disruption can be as destabilizing as physical harm. The women in these camps were confronting precisely that phenomenon. They had been taught that capture equaled degradation, yet their physical integrity had largely been preserved. The anticipated horror had not occurred. Instead, a subtler challenge emerged: how to reconcile survival with inherited codes of honor. Some women reinterpreted survival as self-duty. To live was to carry memory. To endure was to protect children. This reframing allowed them to preserve dignity without denying reality. Others maintained emotional distance from their captors, even while acknowledging fair treatment. They distinguished between individual behavior and national conflict. The war, in their minds, remained a geopolitical struggle. Individual interactions did not erase that. There were also moments of unexpected humanity that intensified internal conflict. A guard who shared news of the war's progress respectfully. A medic who reassured a frightened mother. A translator who explained procedures patiently. These encounters personalized the former abstraction of enemy. Humanization complicates hatred. As weeks turned into months, the global war shifted dramatically. American bombing campaigns intensified over mainland Japan. Cities such as Hiroshima and Nagasaki would soon experience unprecedented devastation. News of destruction filtered into camps gradually, sometimes through official announcements, sometimes through rumor. For detained women, this information produced mixed emotions: sorrow for homeland, anxiety for relatives, uncertainty about national future. At the same time, they remained physically safe within the structures established by their captors. Safety provided by the enemy, vulnerability endured by the homeland. The inversion was profound. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in August 1945, the ideological foundation of wartime identity shifted overnight. The divine invincibility narrative collapsed.
The state that it condemned surrender had itself surrendered. For women already in captivity, this moment recontextualized everything. They were no longer exceptions to the rule, they were participants in a broader national defeat. Shame did not vanish instantly, but its meaning changed. The internal struggle, therefore, was not resolved by external kindness alone. It required time, reflection, and gradual cultural transformation in post-war Japan. Many women carried complex memories for decades, neither purely resentful nor wholly reconciled. They remembered the fear before capture, the certainty of impending brutality, the shock of restraint, the order of camp life, and the quiet erosion of absolute belief. War had shaped their expectations. Reality had reshaped their understanding. The fourth chapter of their story is not about physical confinement. It is about psychological transition, from indoctrinated fear to nuanced awareness, from rigid ideology to complicated memory. In the end, the most enduring battlefield was not Saipan or Okinawa. It was the human mind, negotiating honor, survival, and truth in the aftermath of shattered certainty.
August 1945. The voice of Emperor Hirohito broadcast across Japan, announcing surrender. For the first time in modern history, the nation acknowledged defeat. The war between the Empire of Japan and the United States was over. For Japanese women who had experienced captivity under American control, the end of the war did not bring immediate clarity. It brought transition. Repatriation began gradually. Camps were reorganized. Transportation logistics were arranged. Former detainees were processed for return to their communities. The physical journey home was measurable. The psychological journey was not. Japan in late 1945 was unrecognizable. Major cities lay in ruins. Industrial infrastructure had collapsed. Food shortages were severe. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had introduced a new scale of devastation to human history. In this environment, survival itself became the dominant concern. For returning women, reintegration unfolded in layers. Families often expressed relief, but conversations about captivity were restrained. Silence became common, not because nothing had happened, but because what had happened contradicted wartime expectations. How does one explain that the feared enemy behaved with restraint? In many cases, former captives chose not to elaborate. Post-war Japanese society faced enormous structural transformation under Allied occupation. The arrival of General Douglas MacArthur as Supreme Commander for the Allied powers marked a new political era. Constitutional reform, demilitarization, and democratization reshaped the national framework. The ideology that had once condemned surrender was officially dismantled. Within this shifting landscape, memory became complicated. Some women privately acknowledged that their treatment in American custody had been more humane than anticipated. Others maintained emotional distance from that conclusion, focusing instead on national suffering during bombings and occupation. Reconciliation between former enemies did not occur overnight. It unfolded gradually through diplomacy, economic rebuilding, and cultural exchange. The 1951 Treaty of San Francisco formally ended the state of war between Japan and many allied nations, including the United States. Yet treaties resolve legal conflict, not emotional residue. For decades, many former detainees rarely spoke publicly about their experiences. In part, this silence reflected cultural tendencies toward privacy. In part, it reflected the ambiguity of their memories. They had expected brutality and instead encountered order. That narrative did not fit easily into simplified post-war stories of victimhood or heroism. Historians later examined these accounts within broader analyses of wartime propaganda. They noted how states construct enemy images to mobilize populations. Fear becomes instrument. Dehumanization becomes strategy. The women's experiences illustrated the power and the limits of such narratives. Their shock at humane treatment did not erase the brutality of the Pacific War. Battles such as those on Iwo Jima and Okinawa remain among the bloodiest confrontations of World War II. Civilian suffering was immense. Military casualties were staggering. But within that larger violence, individual encounters sometimes defied expectation. As decades passed, a new generation in both Japan and the United States approached the war through research rather than direct memory. Oral histories gained importance. Survivors who once remained silent began to share measured reflections, not dramatic accusations, not romanticized reconciliation, but nuanced recollection. They described fear before capture as absolute certainty. They described surrender as terror. They described camp life as structured and, in many cases, unexpectedly restrained. The significance of these testimonies lies not in absolving one side or condemning another exclusively. It lies in demonstrating how perception shapes experience. Propaganda had convinced them that capture meant annihilation. Reality delivered something different. This divergence forced a reevaluation not only of the enemy, but of the state that had constructed the fear. Post-war U.S.-Japan relations evolved into one of the most stable alliances in the modern world. Economic cooperation, security agreements, and cultural exchange replaced open conflict. Former battlefields became sites of memorialization rather than combat. For the women who had once hidden in caves awaiting imagined horrors, this transformation would have seemed inconceivable during the war's darkest days. Their lives continued beyond captivity. Some married, some raised families, some carried private memories without public acknowledgement. Trauma did not disappear simply because expectations were contradicted. Fear leaves imprint, so does disillusionment. But over time, reflection allowed space for complexity. The final lesson of their story is not simplistic optimism. War remains destructive. Propaganda remains powerful. Cultural indoctrination can reshape perception at scale. Yet human behavior, even in conflict, does not always conform perfectly to ideological narratives. The women who once believed they faced inevitable brutality encountered something else: discipline, procedure, and at times restrained humanity. That experience did not erase national tragedy. It did not undo loss, but it altered understanding. History often reduces wars to statistics: divisions deployed, casualties recorded, territories gained or lost. This story operates at a different resolution. It reveals what happens when belief collides with reality, when indoctrination confronts lived experience, when fear meets restraint. The Pacific War ended in devastation. Cities burned, empires dissolved, political systems transformed. But within that vast historical shift were individual moments, quiet, unexpected, disorienting, when long-held certainty fractured. And from that fracture emerged a more complicated truth. The enemy imagined in fear is rarely identical to the human being encountered in reality. That realization for many of these women became the most enduring legacy of captivity. Not the barbed wire, not the guard towers, but the collapse of absolute hatred and the uneasy, irreversible awareness that war had shaped their expectations more than their actual experience.